My name is Michael Thompson, and I used to think that life was something you conquered, not something that conquered you. At 34, I was the regional sales director for Pinnacle Financial Solutions in downtown Chicago, driving a midnight blue BMW that cost more than most people's annual salaries. My corner office on the 37th floor overlooked Lake Michigan, and I had a view that reminded me every morning how far I'd climbed from the South Side apartment where I grew up. That October evening, as I raced down Interstate 94 toward my penthouse in River North, the city lights blurred past my windshield like fallen stars. The leather seats still held the warmth from another 14-hour day of back-to-back meetings, conference calls, and the relentless pursuit of quarterly targets that defined my existence. My iPhone buzzed incessantly on the passenger seat, emails from New York, texts from colleagues, notifications that never seemed to stop demanding my attention. If you believe that miracles still happen, or if you've ever experienced something that deeply touched your faith, share your story in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can continue walking this journey of faith together. I lived in a world where success was measured in decimal points and percentages, where every conversation was a negotiation and every relationship was transactional. My calendar was packed solid for the next 3 months, color-coded in precise blocks that left little room for anything resembling spontaneity or rest. Sleep was something I scheduled between 1 a.m. and 6 a.m. And even then, my dreams were filled with profit margins and client presentations. The radio droned with traffic reports and market updates as I weaved through the evening rush hour traffic. Rain had begun to fall, those first fat drops that splattered against the windshield like warnings I was too busy to heed. My hands gripped the steering wheel with the same intensity I brought to every aspect of my life, controlled, purposeful, relentless. My phone rang, and I glanced at the screen. Rebecca home. My wife's name appeared with a photo from our honeymoon in Tuscany 3 years ago, when we still looked at each other like we were discovering something precious rather than cataloging disappointments. I let it go to voicemail. I knew what she wanted to discuss, the same conversation we'd been having for months about slowing down, about starting a family, about finding some balance in our marriage that didn't revolve around my absence. The rain intensified as I pushed the BMW harder through the traffic, passing slower vehicles with the impatience of someone who believed time was a resource to be optimized rather than a gift to be savored. My reflection in the side mirror showed a face that had grown harder over the years. Sharp cheekbones and eyes that had lost their capacity for wonder somewhere between my first promotion and my third raise. I thought about the morning conversation with Rebecca before I left for work. She'd been standing by the kitchen window in her blue silk robe, the one I'd bought her for her birthday last year, holding a cup of coffee and watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "When was the last time you watched a sunrise with me?" "Michael?" she'd asked, her voice carrying that particular sadness that comes from loving someone who's always just out of reach. "I don't have time for sunrises," I'd replied, grabbing my briefcase and kissing her forehead with the distracted affection of someone already mentally rehearsing the day's first meeting. The hurt in her eyes was something I'd registered and filed away for later consideration, like an email marked for follow-up that would never get answered. The BMW's engine hummed with precision as I accelerated toward the exit that would take me home to another evening of work spread across the dining room table. Another night of being physically present but emotionally absent. My reflections stared back at me from the rain-streaked window, and for just a moment I wondered when I'd become a stranger to myself. The city stretched out around me in all directions, millions of lights representing millions of lives. And I felt the peculiar isolation that comes from being surrounded by people yet connected to no one. My success had built walls around me, each achievement another brick in the fortress that kept the world at a safe distance. I'd learned to measure my worth in acquisitions and accomplishments, in the size of my office and the speed of my car, in everything except the things that might actually matter. My mother used to tell me stories when I was young, sitting on the edge of my bed in our cramped apartment, while police sirens wailed in the distance. She'd talk about guardian angels and divine intervention, about a God who cared about sparrows and children and the broken-hearted. I'd outgrown those stories somewhere along the way, traded them in for business school theories and market analysis, for the cold comfort of spreadsheets and profit projections. Thunder rolled across the sky as I approached the construction zone near Millennium Park, where orange barrels and temporary barriers had been funneling traffic into a single lane for weeks. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the asphalt into a mirror that reflected the city's neon promises back at the sky. I checked my watch, 7:47 p.m. I was already late for the conference call with the West Coast team, and my patience was wearing thin. The traffic slowed to a crawl, and I drummed my fingers against the steering wheel with the rhythm of someone who'd forgotten how to be still. Around me, other drivers sat in their metal cocoons, illuminated by the blue glow of their phones. Each of us isolated in our own urgent, important worlds, too busy to notice the sky weeping above us, too distracted to realize how fragile our carefully constructed lives really were. As I waited in the traffic, surrounded by the sound of rain and engines and the distant hum of a city that never slept, I had no idea that everything I thought I knew about life, about purpose, about what really mattered, was about to change in the span of a few heartbeats. I had no idea that sometimes the most profound encounters happen not in churches or meditation retreats, but on rain-slicked highways where heaven touches earth in ways that shatter our certainties and rebuild our souls. The traffic began to move, and I pressed the accelerator, eager to escape the construction zone and get home to my scheduled evening of important work. Behind me, the city lights grew smaller in my rearview mirror, and ahead of me stretched the dark highway that would carry me toward the most important conversation of my life. The construction zone finally opened up ahead of me, and I felt that familiar surge of relief as the traffic began to flow again. I pushed the BMW up to 75 miles per hour, maybe 80, the speedometer needle climbing, as my impatience overcame my caution. The rain had intensified into a steady downpour that drummed against the roof like an urgent message I couldn't quite decipher. My phone buzzed again, and this time it was a text from Marcus Rodriguez, my top client. "Thompson, need those quarterly projections by midnight. Singapore deal depends on it." I glanced at the message as I drove, calculating in my head how long it would take me to pull together the analysis he wanted. Another late night, another promise to Rebecca that I'd be home for dinner broken before it was even made. The highway curved ahead, following the shoreline of Lake Michigan, where the water disappeared into darkness. Streetlights created pools of amber illumination that barely penetrated the curtain of rain, and I found myself leaning forward, squinting through the windshield as the wipers fought a losing battle against the deluge. The radio crackled with a weather alert, severe thunderstorm warning, possible hail, reduced visibility, but I was too focused on the text message to pay attention. I reached for my phone to respond to Marcus, my eyes leaving the road for what couldn't have been more than 3 seconds. In that moment, the world shifted. A semi-truck in the right lane hit a puddle of standing water, sending up a wall of spray that obliterated my vision completely. I felt the BMW hydroplane, the steering wheel suddenly useless in my hands as the car became a missile guided by physics rather than intention. Time compressed and expanded simultaneously. I remember the sensation of weightlessness as the car spun sideways across 2 lanes of traffic. I remember the headlights of an oncoming 18-wheeler growing larger in my passenger window like twin suns approaching Earth. I remember the metallic taste of adrenaline flooding my mouth and the way my chest constricted as I realized there was nothing I could do to prevent what was about to happen. The impact came from my left side. where the semi's front bumper caught my BMW just behind the driver's door. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard, metal screaming against metal, glass exploding into diamond fragments, the percussion of my airbag deploying like a gunshot in an enclosed space. My body became a rag doll, thrown against the door, then forward into the steering wheel, then back against the seat as the car rolled once, twice, before sliding on its roof into the concrete median barrier. When the motion finally stopped, I found myself hanging upside down in my seatbelt, blood dripping upward from my forehead onto the roof of the car that had become the floor. The engine hissed and ticked in the darkness, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of other vehicles stopping, car doors slamming, voices shouting instructions I couldn't quite make out. My legs were pinned beneath the crumpled dashboard, and every attempt to move sent lightning bolts of pain through my spine. The metallic smell of gasoline mixed with the copper tang of blood, and I could feel something warm and sticky pooling beneath my head. My iPhone had disappeared somewhere in the chaos, along with my briefcase. My carefully organized life reduced to scattered debris in the wreckage of German engineering. Sir, can you hear me?" A voice called from outside the car, muffled by the rain and the ringing in my ears. I tried to respond, but my voice came out as a whisper, barely audible even to myself. The taste of blood filled my mouth, and each breath felt like breathing through broken glass. I thought about Rebecca, probably sitting at our dining room table with 2 plates of food growing cold, wondering why I hadn't called, why I was later than usual, even by my standards. I thought about the conference call I was supposed to be leading in 15 minutes, about the quarterly projections that Marcus needed by midnight, about all the urgent, important things that suddenly seemed as insubstantial as smoke. Fire department sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer but still maddeningly far away. I could feel consciousness slipping away from me like water through cupped hands, and I fought to stay alert, to stay present in my body, even as every instinct screamed at me to retreat into the darkness that promised relief from the pain. "We're going to get you out of there," another voice called, closer now. "Stay with us, okay? What's your name?" I tried to answer, but the words wouldn't form. "Michael Thompson, Regional Sales Director C, corner office on the 37th floor. BMW owner, husband to Rebecca, son of Martha Thompson who used to tell stories about angels." But none of those identities seemed to matter now, suspended upside down in a cage of twisted metal. The rain continued to fall through the shattered windows, cold drops mixing with the blood on my face. I could hear the rescue workers moving around the car, their boots splashing through puddles, their radios crackling with codes and coordinates that meant life or death. "We need the jaws of life," someone said, and I understood that the car had become my prison, that the very luxury and security I'd surrounded myself with had become a trap. My vision began to fade at the edges, darkness creeping in like a tide. I tried to hold on to consciousness, to stay present for whatever came next, but my grip was slipping. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear someone praying, a woman's voice, maybe a paramedic or a bystander, asking God to watch over the person in the overturned car, asking for protection and healing and mercy. Prayer. When was the last time I'd prayed? When was the last time I'd considered that there might be something beyond quarterly reports and market projections, something beyond the carefully constructed world of achievement and acquisition that had defined my existence for so long? My mother's bedtime stories came back to me in fragments: guardian angels, divine love, a God who cared about the lost and broken. As the darkness closed in around me, as the rescue workers called my name and asked me to stay awake, I found myself wondering if those childhood stories might have contained more truth than I'd been willing to admit. I found myself wondering if, in this moment when everything I'd built was literally crashing down around me, there might be something else waiting to catch me. The last thing I remembered before consciousness slipped away was the sound of metal being cut, the whine of hydraulic tools trying to free me from my prison of steel and glass, and the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, was listening to the prayers being whispered into the rain-soaked night. I woke up 3 days later in Northwestern Memorial Hospital, surrounded by the antiseptic smell of disinfectant and the steady beeping of machines that monitored the rhythm of a life I barely recognized as my own. My left leg was elevated in traction, encased in a cast from hip to ankle. Tubes ran into my arms, and my head felt like it had been used as a baseball by an angry giant. Rebecca was asleep in the chair beside my bed, her hand resting on the white hospital blanket near mine, but not quite touching. As if, even in sleep, she wasn't sure I was really there. When she woke up and saw me looking at her, she started crying immediately. Not the delicate tears of relief I might have expected, but deep, body-shaking sobs that spoke of 3 days of uncertainty, of sitting in waiting rooms and talking to doctors, and facing the possibility that she might become a widow before she ever really became a wife. "Michael," she whispered, reaching for my hand. "Oh, Michael, I thought I'd lost you." The doctors came and went in a parade of white coats and serious expressions. Dr. Sarah Chen, my orthopedic surgeon, explained that my left leg had been shattered in 4 places and would require at least 6 months of recovery before I could walk normally again. Dr. James Morrison, the neurologist, ran tests to check for traumatic brain injury, shining lights in my eyes and asking me to follow his finger while he explained that I'd suffered a severe concussion that could affect my memory and cognitive function for weeks or months. "You're lucky to be alive," Dr. Chen said, reviewing my charts. "Another few inches to the right, and that semi would have hit you directly. As it is, you're looking at a long recovery, but you should make a full recovery." Lucky. The word felt strange in my mouth. Foreign as a language I'd never learned to speak. Rebecca brought me my phone on the 2nd day I was awake, and I watched in detachment as hundreds of emails poured in, colleagues asking about meetings, clients demanding updates, a digital avalanche of urgent, important things that had somehow continued to exist in a world where I no longer did. My assistant, Jennifer, had sent a gentle message explaining that she was handling my accounts temporarily, that everyone understood I needed time to recover, that my job would be waiting when I was ready to return. But staring at that screen full of demands and deadlines, I felt something I'd never experienced before: complete and utter indifference. The quarterly projections Marcus had needed by midnight the night of my accident had been completed by someone else. The Singapore deal had moved forward without my input. The urgent meeting I'd been rushing to had been rescheduled and conducted and concluded, and the world had not ended. In fact, it seemed to be spinning along quite nicely without Michael Thompson and his indispensable contributions. The physical therapy started the following week, and it was humbling in ways I couldn't have imagined. Lisa Martinez, my therapist, was a tiny woman with enormous patience who helped me learn to walk again like a child taking his first steps. The simple act of moving from bed to wheelchair left me exhausted and sweating, my body betraying everything I'd believed about my own strength and control. "The body remembers," Lisa told me as I struggled with the parallel bars, my legs shaking from the effort of supporting my own weight. "It just needs time to rebuild trust in itself." Trust. Another foreign concept for someone who'd spent years believing that success came from controlling every variable, from leaving nothing to chance. Rebecca visited every day, bringing flowers that brightened the sterile hospital room and conversation that tried to pretend everything was normal. She told me about her work at the elementary school where she taught 3rd grade, about the children who asked when Mr. Thompson would come visit their class like he used to promise to do. She told me about our friends who'd called to check on me, about the neighbors who'd offered to help with anything we needed. But there was something different in her eyes now, a wariness that hadn't been there before. One evening, as she helped me with dinner, she finally said what we'd both been thinking. "I keep waiting for you to ask about work," she said quietly, "to start making phone calls and demanding to be released early so you can get back to your meetings." I looked at her, this woman I'd married but barely knew, and realized I didn't have an answer. The truth was, I hadn't been thinking about work at all. I'd been thinking about the accident, about the moment when everything I'd built came crashing down around me, about the strange sense that I was living in someone else's life and waiting for the real Michael Thompson to show up and reclaim it. "Maybe I don't want to go back," I heard myself say, and the words surprised us both. Dr. Peterson, the hospital chaplain, started visiting in my third week. He was an elderly black man with silver hair and kind eyes who never pushed religion, but somehow made the room feel lighter when he was present. "Trauma changes us," he said during one of our conversations. "Sometimes it breaks us down so we can be built back up differently." "I don't know who I am anymore," I admitted to him one afternoon when Rebecca had gone home to shower and change clothes. "Everything that defined me, my work, my success, my control, it all just disappeared in 3 seconds on the highway." "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," Dr. Peterson said gently. "Maybe the person you were before needed to be lost, so the person you're meant to become could be found." Night was the hardest time. The hospital grew quiet, except for the distant sounds of nurses making rounds and machines keeping watch over broken bodies. I would lie in the darkness, staring at the ceiling and replaying those final moments before the accident, reaching for my phone, taking my eyes off the road, the sensation of losing control. But more than the physical memory of the crash, I found myself haunted by a deeper question. What if I died that night? What would have mattered? What would have been left behind? My corner office would have been cleaned out and given to someone else. My clients would have been reassigned. My BMW would have been replaced by another BMW. And the quarterly projections would have been completed by another ambitious young executive hungry for success. But what about Rebecca? What about the sunrises I'd never watched, the conversations I'd never had, the life I'd been too busy to live? The nightmares started in my 4th week. I would dream about the accident, but in the dreams, it never ended. I would be trapped forever in that overturned car, hanging upside down while urgent, important phone calls buzzed around me like angry wasps. I would wake up gasping, my heart racing, the taste of blood and gasoline still fresh in my mouth. It was during one of those sleepless nights, around 3 in the morning, that I first heard it, a voice so quiet I almost thought I was imagining it, calling my name from somewhere beyond the darkness. Michael. Not demanding or urgent like the voices from my old life, but patient, gentle, as if whoever was speaking had all the time in the world to wait for me to listen. I looked around the room, but I was alone. The hallway outside was empty except for the night nurse making her rounds, yet the voice had been as clear as if someone was sitting beside my bed, and for reasons I couldn't explain, it filled me with a peace I hadn't felt since before I could remember. "I'm listening," I whispered into the darkness, feeling foolish but somehow certain that someone was there to hear me. The voice came again 2 nights later, this time more distinct, though still so soft it might have been mistaken for the whisper of air through the hospital's ventilation system. I had been lying awake, staring at the digital clock that marked the slow passage of the hours. 2:17 a.m., 2:18 a.m., 2:19 a.m. The morphine drip had been reduced as my body healed, and without its numbing embrace, the pain in my leg had become a constant, throbbing reminder of my mortality. "Michael, why are you afraid?" The question hung in the air like incense, filling the sterile room with something I could only describe as presence. not a presence. The presence, as if the very space around my bed had become charged with an energy that made my skin tingle and my heart race. I sat up as much as the traction would allow, scanning the shadows for any sign of who might be speaking. "Who's there?" I whispered, feeling simultaneously foolish and terrified. The logical part of my mind, the part that had built financial models and negotiated million-dollar deals, insisted that I was experiencing some kind of medication-induced hallucination, a side effect of trauma and painkillers. But another part of me, a part that had been dormant for decades, recognized something ancient and familiar in that voice. The room remained empty, but the presence grew stronger, as if someone had taken the chair beside my bed without making a sound. The machines continued their electronic chorus. The hallway beyond my door hummed with its late-night activity. But within the four walls of my hospital room, time seemed to slow and thicken like honey. "You've been running for so long," the voice continued, and now I was certain it wasn't my imagination. The tone was male, warm, but infinitely sad, as if the speaker carried the weight of every sorrow the world had ever known. "Running toward things that can't satisfy, away from the only thing that can." I wanted to argue, to defend the life I'd built with its impressive salary and corner office and sophisticated urban lifestyle. But suspended there in my hospital bed, surrounded by the wreckage of everything I'd thought mattered, the words died in my throat. What could I say? That I'd been happy? That my relentless pursuit of success had brought me joy? That the distance I'd created between myself and everyone I claimed to love was actually connection? "I don't understand," I finally managed to say, my voice barely audible even to myself. "You will." The presence remained with me for what felt like hours, though when I looked at the clock again, only minutes had passed. I found myself thinking about my childhood, about Sunday mornings in the little Baptist church on Ashland Avenue, where my mother had dragged me every week despite my protests. I remembered the way the light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting rainbows on the wooden pews, and the way the congregation sang hymns with voices that rose like prayers toward heaven. I hadn't thought about those Sunday mornings in years, had dismissed them as relics of a simpler time when people needed fairy tales to make sense of a cruel world. But now, in the darkness of Northwestern Memorial Hospital, I found myself wondering if I'd been wrong. What if the fairy tales were actually the life I'd been living? The fantasy that success and achievement could fill the emptiness inside me, that I could build a life worth living out of quarterly profits and performance bonuses. The next morning, Dr. Peterson found me staring out the window at the gray Chicago sky, watching pigeons nest on the building ledge across the street. "You look different today," he said, settling into the chair beside my bed with the easy grace of someone accustomed to sitting with people in crisis. "I think someone visited me last night," I told him, expecting skepticism or concern about my mental state. Instead, he nodded as if such things were perfectly normal. "What did they say?" I related the conversation, such as it was, feeling self-conscious about how strange it all sounded in the clear light of day. But Dr. Peterson listened without interruption, his face growing more thoughtful as I spoke. "My grandmother used to say that God speaks loudest when we're finally quiet enough to listen," he said when I finished. "And maybe being forced to lie still has given you ears to hear what was always there." Rebecca arrived for her afternoon visit with a stack of get-well cards from my colleagues and a fruit basket from Marcus Rodriguez. She seemed surprised to find me sitting up in bed, actually engaged with my surroundings, instead of staring blankly at the ceiling like I'd been doing for weeks. "You look better," she said, kissing my forehead and settling into her usual chair. "More present, somehow. Present." The word echoed the feeling I'd had in the early morning hours, that sense of being fully here, fully awake, for the first time in longer than I could remember. I watched Rebecca arrange the get-well cards on my bedside table, her movements graceful and efficient, and realized how little attention I'd paid to her in the years since our wedding. When had she started wearing her hair longer? When had those tiny lines appeared at the corners of her eyes? When had she stopped sharing her dreams with me because she'd learned I wasn't really listening? "Rebecca," I said, catching her hand as she reached for the water pitcher. "I'm sorry." She looked startled, as if apologies were another language I'd never learned to speak. For what? For everything. For being absent, even when I was present. For making you feel like you married a stranger. For caring more about profit margins than morning conversations. Her eyes filled with tears, and she squeezed my hand gently. "Michael, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," I interrupted. "I've been so busy building a life that I forgot to live one. I've been so focused on success that I missed everything that actually succeeds." That night, the presence returned stronger than before. This time, I wasn't afraid. I lay in the darkness, surrounded by the gentle sounds of machines and distant conversations, and waited. The voice, when it came, was closer now, as if the speaker had moved from the chair to the edge of my bed. "Do you remember what you asked for in the car?" The memory hit me like a physical blow. Those final seconds before the semi-truck's impact, when I'd felt my life slipping away from me like sand through an hourglass. In my terror and desperation, I'd called out to a God I'd spent years ignoring, begging not to die alone. "You heard me," I whispered. "I never stopped hearing you, Michael, even when you stopped calling." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. I thought about all the nights I'd worked late, all the Sunday mornings I'd spent at the office instead of in church, all the times I'd chosen the urgent over the important, the temporal over the eternal. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to come home." The presence faded with the dawn, but the peace it brought remained, settling over me like a blanket that couldn't be removed. I spent the morning thinking about home. Not the penthouse apartment in River North, with its view of the lake and its carefully curated modern furniture, but something deeper, older, more fundamental, a sense of belonging that had nothing to do with achievement or acquisition. A place where I was known and loved, not for what I could produce, but for who I was. By the time the breakfast tray arrived, I had made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks before. I asked the nurse to call Rebecca and tell her I needed to see her as soon as possible. Then I called my assistant and asked her to clear my calendar, not for the day, not for the week, but indefinitely. It was time to discover who I really was when I wasn't trying to be anyone at all. Rebecca arrived within the hour, her face flushed from running through the hospital corridors, her teacher's bag still slung over her shoulder as if she'd left her classroom mid-sentence. "Michael, what's wrong? The nurse said you needed to see me urgently." I took her hand and pulled her gently into the chair beside my bed, studying her face as if seeing it for the first time. The morning light streaming through the window caught the gold flecks in her brown eyes, and I remembered suddenly why I'd fallen in love with her 7 years ago at the Northwestern alumni mixer. She'd been standing by herself near the hors d'oeuvres table, wearing a blue dress that matched her eyes and laughing at something her friend had whispered in her ear. When she'd looked up and caught me staring, instead of looking away, she'd smiled, a smile that seemed to say she saw something in me worth seeing. "Nothing's wrong," I said, and as the words left my mouth, I realized they were true in a way they hadn't been for years. "Everything's right. Maybe for the first time in my adult life, everything is exactly as it should be." She looked at me with the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust sudden declarations of happiness from a husband who'd forgotten how to be happy. "No, the pain medication isn't making you say things you don't mean, is it?" I squeezed her hand. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen with an open mind. Last night, I had a visitor." I told her about the voice, about the presence that had filled my hospital room with a peace I couldn't explain or argue away. I told her about my childhood memories of church, about my mother's bedtime stories of guardian angels, about the way everything I'd thought mattered had crumbled in those 3 seconds of twisted metal and breaking glass. Rebecca listened without interrupting, her expression cycling through skepticism, concern, and something that might have been hope. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her thumb tracing circles on the back of my hand. "When I was 12, she said finally, my little brother Tommy got lost in Grant Park during a family picnic. We searched for hours, police, park rangers, hundreds of volunteers. I remember standing by the lake as the sun was setting, and I prayed harder than I'd ever prayed in my life. I asked God to send Tommy home safe, and I promised I'd never doubt again if he did." She paused, looking out the window at the pigeons that had become my daily companions. 20 minutes later, a park ranger found Tommy asleep under a bush near the playground. He was fine, scared and hungry, but fine, and I kept my promise, Michael. I never stopped believing that God hears us when we call. Why didn't you ever tell me that story? Her smile was sad and beautiful at the same time. When would I have told you? Between your conference calls and your client dinners, during the 15 minutes we spent together before you fell asleep each night. You made it very clear that faith was for people who weren't strong enough to handle reality on their own. The truth of her words hit me like a physical blow. I remembered the eye rolls, the dismissive comments when she'd mentioned wanting to find a church, the way I'd scheduled golf games and business brunches on Sunday mornings to avoid conversations about spirituality. I'd been so busy building my empire that I'd torn down everything that might have sustained it. That afternoon, Dr. Peterson arrived for his daily visit to find me sitting up in bed with a legal pad, writing what looked like a letter. "Feeling inspired?" he asked, settling into his chair with the patient presence that had become such a comfort. "I'm writing to my mother," I said, not looking up from the page. "She died 4 years ago, and I never thanked her for all those bedtime stories, for dragging me to church, for trying to teach me that there was something beyond what I could see and measure and control. What would you say to her if you could?" I set down the pen and looked at this man who'd somehow become my confessor, my guide through territory I'd never learned to navigate. I'd tell her she was right. I'd tell her I'm sorry for spending so many years thinking I was smarter than the God she loved so much. I'd tell her I finally understand why she used to cry during hymns, why she'd sit in that little church every Sunday morning, even when arthritis made it hard for her to walk. Dr. Peterson nodded slowly. Maybe she already knows. That evening, as Rebecca was preparing to leave for the night, she turned back from the doorway with a question that caught me off guard. "Michael, what are you going to do when you get out of here?" It was a practical question, the kind that would have been easy to answer a month ago. Return to work, catch up on missed meetings, double down on the accounts I'd been neglecting. But now, the thought of returning to my corner office felt like contemplating a return to prison. "I don't know," I admitted. "For the first time in my adult life, I honestly don't know what comes next." "Are you scared?" I considered the question seriously, probing the uncertainty like a tongue exploring a loose tooth. "No," I said, surprising myself. "I'm not scared. I'm expectant, I think. Like I'm waiting for instructions from someone who actually knows what he's doing." She kissed me goodnight, and I settled back against my pillows to wait for sleep. The nightmares had stopped coming, replaced by dreams I couldn't quite remember, but that left me feeling refreshed and hopeful. Sometimes I dreamed of light, warm and golden like summer sunsets. Sometimes I dreamed of walking, not the painful, assisted walking of physical therapy, but the easy stride of someone who knew exactly where he was going. Around midnight, I woke to find my room filled with the most extraordinary fragrance. Not the antiseptic smell of hospital disinfectant, but something like jasmine and cedar, like the garden behind my childhood home where my mother had grown vegetables and flowers in equal measure. The scent was so strong, so real, that I looked around for its source, expecting to find that Rebecca had brought flowers I'd somehow missed. The room was empty except for me and my machines, but the fragrance lingered, and with it came a memory so vivid it took my breath away. I was 8 years old, sitting in my mother's lap in the wooden pew at Mount Calvary Baptist Church, listening to Pastor Williams preach about the Good Shepherd who left 99 sheep to search for the one that was lost. My mother's arms were around me, and she smelled like the jasmine perfume she wore to church and the cedar sachet she kept in her jewelry box. Even when we run away, Pastor Williams had said that long ago Sunday, even when we think we're too far gone to be found, the shepherd comes looking. He doesn't wait for us to find our way home. He comes to wherever we are, even if it's the loneliest, most broken place we can imagine. As the memory faded, I understood that I'd been found, not in a church or a moment of grand spiritual awakening, but here, in a hospital bed, surrounded by the wreckage of everything I'd thought mattered. The shepherd hadn't waited for me to get my life together or figure out the right prayers to say. He'd come to find me exactly where I was, broken, confused, and finally ready to admit I'd been lost all along. I spent the rest of the night in a state of wakeful peace, watching the city lights twinkle beyond my window and feeling, for the first time in decades, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The decision came to me not as a lightning bolt of revelation, but as the gentle certainty of sunrise, inevitable, natural, exactly as it should be. I woke on a Tuesday morning in my 6th week at Northwestern Memorial, and before I was fully conscious, I knew what I had to do. The knowledge sat in my chest like a warm stone, solid and unshakable, carrying with it a peace that had nothing to do with the morphine drip that had been discontinued 3 days earlier. Dr. Chen made her rounds early that morning, her efficient presence filling the room as she checked my charts and examined the latest X-rays of my healing leg. "You're making excellent progress, Michael," she said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a surgeon whose work was proceeding according to plan. "Another 2 weeks here for observation, then we can start talking about discharge to a rehabilitation facility." "Doctor," I said, catching her attention as she prepared to move on to her next patient, "I need to make some phone calls today. Can someone bring me a phone?" She nodded, making a note on her chart. "Of course. Jennifer from your office has been calling every few days for updates. I'm sure she'll be pleased to hear you're ready to start thinking about practical matters." But the calls I needed to make had nothing to do with quarterly projections or client meetings. The first was to Rebecca, asking her to come in early if possible. The second was to Marcus Rodriguez, requesting a meeting that would change the trajectory of both our professional relationship and my life. Rebecca arrived during her lunch break, still wearing the paint-stained apron she used during art class with her third graders. She'd been bringing more of herself to our conversations lately, stories from her classroom, observations about the world beyond the hospital walls, dreams she'd tucked away during the years when my absence had made sharing them feel pointless. "Michael, you look different again," she said, settling into what had become her chair. "More decided somehow." "I am decided," I said, reaching for her hand. "Rebecca, I'm going to resign from Pinnacle Financial." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. I watched her face cycle through surprise, concern, and finally, something that looked like relief. "What will you do?" "I don't know yet," I admitted, "but I know what I won't do. I won't spend another day chasing things that don't matter while ignoring everything that does. I won't sacrifice our marriage on the altar of success that doesn't actually succeed at anything except keeping me busy enough to avoid facing who I really am." She was quiet for a long moment, studying my face as if memorizing it. "Are you sure this isn't just the trauma talking? The fear of getting back behind the wheel, so to speak?" I'd been asking myself the same question for days, probing the certainty. I felt like a skeptic examining a too-good-to-be-true investment opportunity. But every time I imagined returning to my corner office, to the conference calls and client dinners and relentless pursuit of the next deal, my spirit recoiled like flesh from flame. 6 weeks ago, if someone had told me I'd be lying in a hospital bed, planning to throw away a 7-figure income and a partnership track at one of Chicago's most prestigious financial firms, I'd have had them committed for psychological evaluation, I said. But Rebecca, what if I haven't been living at all? What if I've just been existing, going through the motions of a life without ever actually being alive? She leaned forward, her brown eyes bright with tears. What would make you feel alive, Michael? The question opened something inside me, a door I'd kept locked for so many years, I'd forgotten it existed. Behind it were all the dreams I'd dismissed as impractical, all the longings I'd categorized as luxuries I couldn't afford in my pursuit of success. I thought about the children's book I'd started writing in college about a businessman who got lost in his own ambition until he couldn't find his way home. I thought about the volunteer work at the homeless shelter that I'd done briefly after graduation, before my career consumed every spare hour. I thought about the way I felt when I helped Rebecca grade papers on the rare evenings I was home early, reading the innocent wisdom of 8-year-olds who still believed the world was full of magic. I don't know exactly, I said, but I know it has something to do with people instead of profit margins. I know it has something to do with making things better instead of just making things bigger. I know it has something to do with the voice that's been calling me home. Marcus arrived that afternoon wearing his customary $1,000 suit and the expression of someone who'd cleared his schedule for an obligation he'd rather avoid. He carried a tablet loaded with spreadsheets and a leather portfolio containing what I assumed were documents requiring my signature. Urgent, important papers that couldn't wait for my recovery to be complete. "Thompson," he said, settling into the chair with the air of someone conducting business in a location far beneath his standards. "You look better than I expected. The doctors say you'll be back on your feet soon." "Marcus," I said, dispensing with the usual pleasantries, "I'm going to resign." The words hit him like cold water. His tablet slipped in his hands, and for the first time in our 5-year business relationship, Marcus Rodriguez was speechless. I watched him process the information, saw him cycling through disbelief, anger, and the rapid mental calculations of someone wondering how this would affect his own bottom line. "You can't resign," he said finally. "You have contracts, obligations. The Singapore deal alone is worth—" "Assign my accounts to Jennifer," I interrupted. "She's been handling them for 6 weeks anyway, and she knows the clients better than anyone. Promote her to senior associate and give her the raise she should have gotten 2 years ago." Marcus leaned forward, his voice taking on the urgent tone of someone fighting for something he couldn't afford to lose. "Michael, I understand you're going through a difficult time, but let's not make any rash decisions. Take a leave of absence, recover fully. Then we can talk about reducing your workload, maybe bringing in an assistant." "This isn't about workload," I said quietly. "This isn't about the accident or stress or fear of returning to work. This is about the fact that I've been living the wrong life, and I don't want to waste another day pretending it's the right one." He stayed for another 20 minutes, alternating between attempts to change my mind and thinly veiled threats about contractual obligations and industry reputation. When he finally left, his parting words were, "You're making a mistake you'll regret for the rest of your life." But as I watched him stride down the hallway toward the elevators, his phone already pressed to his ear as he began damage control, I felt only relief. The golden handcuffs that had bound me to a life I'd never really chosen were finally unlocked. That evening, Dr. Peterson found me staring out the window at the sunset, painting the Chicago sky in shades of pink and gold. "I hear you made some big decisions today," he said, settling into his chair with the quiet presence that had become such an anchor in my recovery. "The biggest of my life," I said. "And the strangest thing is, they don't feel big. They feel inevitable. Like I'm finally doing what I should have done years ago. What's next?" I turned from the window to look at this man who'd helped guide me through the wilderness of my own confusion. "I think I need to learn how to pray again. Really pray. Not just ask for things I want, but listen for what's being asked of me." Dr. Peterson smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face into something almost beatific. "Prayer isn't about having the right words, Michael. It's about having an open heart, and from what I can see, yours is finally beginning to crack open." As the day nurses changed shifts and the hospital settled into its evening rhythm, I lay in my bed feeling simultaneously exhausted and energized, as if I'd just completed the most important work of my life. Tomorrow, I would begin the practical process of dismantling the career I'd spent 15 years building. But tonight, I would simply rest in the certainty that I was finally heading home. Through my window, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and I found myself remembering a verse from one of the hymns my mother used to hum while she cooked dinner. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." For the first time in my adult life, I understood what those words really meant. The discharge papers felt weightless in my hands, though they represented the end of 7 weeks that had changed everything about who I was and where I was going. Dr. Chen had signed off on my release to outpatient physical therapy. Dr. Morrison had cleared me neurologically, and even Dr. Peterson had given his blessing, though his came in the form of a handwritten note tucked into a small leather-bound book of daily devotions. "The longest journey," his note read, "is the 18 inches from the head to the heart. You've made it, Michael. Now comes the adventure of living from that place." Rebecca arrived at noon to take me home, her face bright with excitement and something that looked like nervousness. She'd been different these past few weeks, more present, more hopeful, as if my transformation had given her permission to hope for things she'd stopped believing were possible. She pushed the wheelchair while I navigated with my walker, both of us laughing at how long it took to cover the distance from my room to the parking garage. "I have something to tell you," she said as she helped me into the passenger seat of her Honda Civic. My BMW had been totaled, of course, and I'd felt only relief when the insurance adjuster called to discuss replacement options. The idea of another luxury car, another status symbol to insulate me from the world I was trying to rejoin, held no appeal whatsoever. "What is it?" I asked, settling back against the seat and marveling at how different everything looked from this angle. Lower, more vulnerable, more connected to the ground and the people walking on it. "I've been talking to Principal Martinez at school," she said, her voice carrying an excitement I hadn't heard in years. "They have an opening for a reading specialist, someone to work with kids who are struggling with literacy. It's part-time, and it doesn't pay much. But Michael, these are children who've been written off by everyone else. They need someone who understands what it feels like to be lost and found." I looked at my wife, really looked at her, and saw something I'd been too busy to notice for far too long. She was beautiful, not just physically, but spiritually, in the way that people who've kept their hearts open despite disappointment are beautiful. "You think I should apply?" "I think you were born for it," she said, starting the engine. "I think maybe everything that happened, the accident, the recovery, the voices in the hospital room, maybe it was all leading to this." The drive home took us past the construction zone, where my old life had ended in twisted metal and broken glass. The orange barrels were gone now, the temporary barriers removed, traffic flowing smoothly in both directions. I felt no anxiety as we passed the spot, only a quiet gratitude for the grace that had met me in my darkest moment and carried me home. Our apartment looked different somehow, smaller but warmer, less like a showplace and more like a home. Rebecca had rearranged the furniture while I was hospitalized, moving my home office setup into storage and creating a reading nook by the window where she'd placed 2 comfortable chairs and a small bookshelf. Sunlight streamed through windows she'd opened to let in the spring air, and I could smell the jasmine she'd planted in the window boxes. "I thought we might start having coffee together in the mornings," she said, following my gaze to the reading nook. "You know, actually talking to each other instead of reading our phones." That first night home, I lay in our bed, really lay in it, paying attention to the weight of the blankets and the warmth of Rebecca's body beside me instead of calculating tomorrow's schedule in my head. Through the open window, I could hear the sounds of the city settling into sleep. Distant traffic, a dog barking, someone playing guitar in an apartment across the courtyard. "Michael," Rebecca's voice was soft in the darkness. "Are you happy?" The question would have been impossible to answer 7 weeks ago. Not because the answer was complicated, but because I'd forgotten what happiness actually felt like. I'd confused it with achievement, with acquisition, with the temporary high of closing a deal or exceeding a quota. But lying there in the dark, my body still healing but my spirit somehow whole for the first time in decades, I understood the difference. "Yes," I said simply, "I'm happy." The job interview at Lincoln Elementary took place 3 weeks later, in a classroom decorated with student artwork and inspirational posters about reading being an adventure. Principal Martinez was a kind woman in her 50s who listened with genuine interest as I stumbled through an explanation of why a former financial executive wanted to work with struggling readers. "Mr. Thompson," she said when I finished, "can you tell me about a time when someone didn't give up on you?" The memory came immediately. Mrs. Henderson, my 3rd grade teacher, who'd kept me after school every day for 2 months to help me learn to read. I'd been falling behind, too embarrassed to admit I couldn't decode the words that seemed to come so easily to my classmates. Instead of labeling me as slow or learning disabled, she'd patiently worked with me, celebrating every small victory until reading became not just possible but joyful. "She saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself," I said. "She didn't give up, even when I wanted to give up on myself." Principal Martinez smiled. "That's exactly what these children need. Someone who remembers what it feels like to struggle and who believes that struggling doesn't mean failing." I started work the following Monday, arriving early to set up the small room that would become my classroom. The walls were bare, waiting to be decorated with the achievements of students who'd been told they weren't smart enough, weren't trying hard enough, weren't worth the extra effort. I thought about the voice that had called to me in the hospital, the presence that had refused to give up on me even when I'd given up on myself. And I understood that I was being given the chance to be that voice for others. My first student was a 7-year-old named Marcus, the same name as my former business partner. Though this, Marcus carried himself with the defeated posture of someone who'd already learned that school was a place where he failed. He sat across from me at the small table, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the floor. "I can't read," he said defiantly, as if expecting me to confirm what everyone else had already told him. "Yet," I said gently, "you can't read yet." "But that's why I'm here, Marcus. That's why we're going to work together until you can." He looked up at me then, suspicion and hope warring in his dark eyes. "You really think I can learn?" I thought about my mother's bedtime stories, about guardian angels and divine love, about the voice that had called my name in a hospital room and refused to let me believe I was beyond redemption. I thought about grace that meets us exactly where we are and carries us home. "I know you can learn," I said, opening the picture book we'd start with, "and I'm not going anywhere until you do." 6 months later, Marcus read his first complete chapter book aloud to his classmates, his voice strong and proud as he shared the story of a little boy who discovers he's braver than he ever imagined. His parents cried in the back of the classroom, and Principal Martinez dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. But I just smiled, remembering another story about sheep and shepherds and the lengths love will go to find what was lost. That evening, Rebecca and I sat in our reading nook, watching the sunset paint our apartment in golden light. She was grading papers while I prepared lessons for the next day, both of us working but together in a way we'd never managed when work was something I did to avoid being present with her. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked, looking up from a student's essay about what they wanted to be when they grew up. The money, the prestige, the corner office. I considered the question seriously, probing for any sense of loss or regret. What I found instead was gratitude, not just for what I'd gained, but for what I'd been freed from. The golden handcuffs were gone, replaced by the simple joy of watching a child's face light up when letters finally became words. Words became sentences, and sentences became doorways to worlds they'd never imagined they could enter. "No," I said, reaching for her hand. "I don't miss any of it." "How can you miss a prison when you finally learned how to fly?" As the stars appeared in the darkening sky above Chicago, I found myself humming one of the hymns my mother used to sing, the words rising naturally from some deep place in my heart where they'd been waiting all these years to be remembered. Through our open window came the sounds of life continuing all around us. Children playing in the courtyard, neighbors calling to each other across balconies, the distant music of a city full of people finding their way home. And somewhere, in the space between one breath and the next, I heard it again, that gentle voice that had called me back from the edge of everything I thought I knew. Only now it wasn't calling me home. It was welcoming me there, confirming what I'd finally learned to believe about grace and second chances and the way love never gives up, even on those who've forgotten how to recognize it when it comes looking for them. I was home, finally, completely, eternally home. Dear listeners, we hope Michael's story touched your heart. If you'd like to keep experiencing powerful stories like this, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which part moved you the most. Every day we share stories that reveal the depth of life and the human heart. We'll be waiting for you in the comments.